It's not news that the U.S. is becoming more secular. But while people have been drifting away from religion for decades, that trend is accelerating right now in people under 40. Many millennials and Gen Zers are turning their backs on organized religion. They want more freedom of thought and self-expression, less rules and rigidity surrounding gender roles and codes of conduct. But what if I told you that there is a small but growing trend in those same generations of people who are seeking just the opposite? These people are looking to older and more orthodox forms of faith to find meaning, purpose, and community, even in the face of what many might consider to be more sexist and less tolerant ideas. On How God Works, we usually take a look at the science behind the ways spiritual practices can help people live happier and healthier lives. But today, we're going to do something a little different. We're going to take a look at this trend and ask, why is it happening? And what does that mean for America's changing religious landscape? We'll talk to Kelsey Osgood, a writer and convert to Orthodox Judaism, about the appeal of embracing centuries-old obligations and practices.
There are certain non-negotiables that connect us backwards thousands of years in the past, and that provides this really solid foundation. I feel like when I converted, I committed to living my life as best I could as a Jew, but also as a person. And I feel like I made that pact with God, and I can't go back on it. And there's something sort of refreshingly clear about all that.
And we'll talk to Julia Yost, senior editor of First Things magazine, who converted to a more traditional form of Catholicism as a young adult. We'll hear from her about the value she finds in this kind of practice and what might be behind some young people's choices to convert.
I think the middle just is losing its hold on the imaginations of young people. There's just kind of a sense that, you know what, pick your side. If your inclinations are liberal, why not just go all the way? Why be moderate, be progressive? And if you're not interested in being progressive, if you want to hang on to something, if you want something traditional, you have to do the kind of self-consistent, really self-aware, straight-up trad version of that.
I'm Dave DeSteno, and this is How God Works. Kelsey Osgood grew up in Connecticut in the late 80s and 90s, and she was raised in a way that many Americans might recognize. I suppose you could call it culturally Christian.
We did celebrate Easter and Christmas, but mostly in the way that many secular Americans do, in terms of we gave gifts, we had family meals, but we didn't talk about God or the tenets of Christianity or any other sorts of spirituality.
So maybe it's not so surprising that by the time she was 9, Kelsey had decided that both Santa and God were a hoax. Throughout her teens, she was a committed atheist. Unfortunately, she also committed to a much more dangerous path around the same time.
I developed anorexia, which was something that came to color big portions of my life from the age of 13 until my early 20s. I see a lot of spiritual malaise when I look back on that experience. I had rejected this idea that there was a God present in our lives. There was a figure who maybe loved and cared about us. There was an overarching moral and spiritual structure to the universe. Instead of really feeling like liberated from that, it felt very depressing. I sort of looked for that in other places, and anorexia kind of actually filled that void in a pretty logical way. It gave me lots of rules to live by. It gave me a clear sense of whether I was succeeding or failing.
It did not, however, give her a good reason to take better care of herself. And when she came across writings about postmodern theory and moral relativism in her college years, she started to wonder if that was really such a problem.
A lot of them seemed to have as a fundamental baseline this idea that each individual sort of decides their own truth and comes to their own sense of right and wrong. So I had this moment where I felt like, okay, maybe actually this is my truth. Maybe I am supposed to live this way. Live kind of in scare quotes, because obviously by taking that on, I wouldn't be living for a very long time or living what many people would consider to be a happy or a healthy or successful life. But maybe this is the life that I'm supposed to lead.
So Kelsey went to her therapist, who happened to be a convert to Christianity, to announce her decision to quit therapy and simply accept her anorexia.
She argued quite articulately, I felt against what she saw as this morally relative stance that would surely mean that I would not live for a very long time. And then at the end of this conversation, she just sort of looked at me and said, well, I'll pray for you. I'm giving this over to God. Not that she was going to not treat me anymore, but she was recognizing that there was something in my struggle that sort of transcended her and myself. I think it took a while for me to realize the impact of that experience, but that was sort of this major turning point for me in my life where I started to feel like there was something beyond what I had considered before that wanted me to not only survive, but to have a good life.
Kelsey continued therapy and eventually completed her journey to recovery. But this experience also opened up a new door within her. She started to become interested in Judaism, and eventually, Orthodox Judaism. At first, she worried she might only be attracted to it because, through its rules, it provided a sense of structure and order, a need that anorexia had responded to. But on deeper thought, she concluded that practicing this form of Judaism actually enriched her life rather than limited it. It fostered flourishing, not disease. And part of that flourishing did help her avoid relapse.
In Judaism, there's this idea that you're not supposed to put yourself in danger. When I became Jewish, I said, I'm not going to do those things anymore because this is the pact, this is the commitment that I've made. And I take that seriously. And so in a way, it kind of takes it off the table. And I know that must sound very simple and oh, okay, fine. So you just do this. But, when I was a teenager and a young adult and I would go in the hospital, everybody always acknowledged that somehow it became easier to eat when you were in the hospital. Why? Because we had no choice. So you might as well just do it. And so somehow that taking away that agonizing element of it, or, the idea that you're going to be the one who's going to decide in the end. I don't want to say that that's the only thing. There were a lot of things that went into recovering. But I think that's a huge part of it.
There's an idea floating around in our culture these days that goes something like, being controlled or bossed around by others is bad for your mental health. And of course, that is often true. But does that mean that total personal freedom, no rules, obligations, or responsibilities at all is the surest path to happiness? Kelsey wasn't so sure about that.
There's this famous Hasidic rabbi, Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, who basically said, you have to be happy. You're commanded to be happy. You have to be joyful. And it's so antithetical to what we think of today when we talk about, sort of mental health. And that would be terribly taboo to say to someone, well, you just have to be happy. But for me, it was actually that sort of thing helps me a lot to just kick myself out of getting into these ruts and feeling alone or adrift or whatever, that I have all this stuff that I can tap into. And I have to change. I have to because I've been given this one life and God gave it to me and I have no choice but to use it in the best way possible. It feels contractual almost, if I'm being honest. I feel like when I converted, I committed to living my life as best I could as a Jew, but also as a person. And I feel like I made that pact with God and I can't go back on it. And there's something sort of refreshingly clear about all that. Okay, well, this is what I have to do now. And so I'm just going to do that. There's not a lot of dithering allowed.
One thing behavioral science has shown us is that while pursuing goals can be a good thing, too much freedom in figuring out how to pursue them can be paralyzing, especially if those choices directly affect us. The idea is simple. If we want to maximize our happiness, then we have to choose to do what will bring us the most pleasure. But when we have too many options available, or have to make too many choices in a given day, picking the right one can feel overwhelming. Psychologists call this decision fatigue.
So I'm 38. People my age and younger, we really grew up in a time where there was just this explosion of choices you had. I'm going to pick a superficial example, but streaming things on your computer. You can watch anything. My children have no concept of the fact that once upon a time you couldn't just watch any movie that you wanted by clicking a button. I think that for a while we operated under the assumption that more choice is better, always, right? And I think very quickly it became apparent that that's not actually always the case. And sometimes having more of a village mentality or having a smaller set of options available to you actually is better for people's well-being. And I think now there's a lot of grappling with this idea of, how do we figure out how to balance this plethora of choices that we have in the modern world with the fact that we know that actually sometimes that paradoxically makes us unhappy. When I was first being introduced to Judaism, I was coming off of many years of my college life, which was really fun and exciting in many ways to be living what I felt was a life of the mind, and also many years in therapy. And I think I was actually, to be honest, just a little burnt out on thinking and feeling, and really felt like there has to be something to balance this focus on introspection and academic thought and a way to sometimes spend time in the real world doing real things.
When it comes to making prescriptions for what to do and how to live, Orthodox religions have a lot to say. Whether the rules of any one faith actually increase happiness is difficult to know. But the simple act of reducing decision fatigue itself can provide a sense of relief. But when it comes to living an Orthodox lifestyle, there's more to it than just following the rules. I mean, I can follow a set of rules that I don't particularly like. Most of us are quite familiar with this from elementary school or our diet and exercise regimens. What makes following the rules of orthodoxy attractive to some is that people are choosing to do so. They're making a statement about what they believe.
Within orthodoxy, for the most part, I don't want to make huge sweeping generalizations, but there seemed to be a much clearer through line between what people believed and what people did.
When you're an Orthodox Jew or a traditional Catholic, your life is infused a bit more with ritual. Prayer, rites, and sacraments aren't just something you do now and again when you think about it. They permeate your life. And what those practices do, for people who value them, is offer a connection not only to one another, but to something greater.
Judaism, particularly Orthodox Judaism, really places a huge emphasis on the things that you do in your life, the practical way of living. For me, it was really quite interesting and exciting to have access to this framework whereby you're connecting with God all the time because of the things that you do. And not only when you're in a church or you're in a Bible study, but all the time when you're making food, when you're eating it, when you're seeing the ocean. There's all these blessings and things that you do and say constantly. If you wanted to be doing it constantly, you could be. Reform Judaism, maybe you go to synagogue on occasion, but once you're not in synagogue, people aren't keeping Shabbat, certainly not to the degree that Orthodox Jews are. So that consistency really appealed to me, of feeling like this is a living tradition that doesn't try to twist itself so drastically to make itself palatable for the modern age to the point where it's not recognizable. And there are certain non-negotiables that we feel like connect us backwards thousands of years in the past. And that provides this really solid foundation. When the rules are always changing, then the ground feels shakier. And then I think people suffer as a result, and the institutions suffer.
This isn't just Kelsey's notion. She's currently working on a book about religious conversion among millennial women. And through her interviews, she's finding this is a common theme.
A number of my subjects in my book have said that they feel that they were really craving something, a place, a group, an ideology, where they felt that the way that people lived and the way that they believed and thought were matching up. I think that in the contemporary age, there are so many things, so many belief systems, so to speak, non-religious ones that you can attach yourself to that are on the marketplace that maybe we feel are infected by corporate interests or by self-serving ones, or that feel to be wholly disembodied, like it's just things that you believe that you post about on Instagram or something like that. people that I've spoken to really were looking for something that made them feel more whole, in that the things that they believed and the things that they did had a connection to one another and had some sort of intellectual grounding that made them feel that they were doing something that had a logic behind it and that was consistent with their beliefs.
One other role religion often fills in people's lives is community. And when it comes to finding connection with other people, modern orthodoxy offers a lot more than Instagram.
When I was 20-something and living in the city by myself, I definitely did not feel like I had a community connection. I mean, I had groups of friends. I wouldn't say that we had like a shared value system. When you are an observant Orthodox Jew, generally speaking, you tend to live within an Orthodox community. Not everybody does, but most people do, and that's part of the idea. You need to be within a walking distance of an Orthodox shul because you can't drive on Shabbat. Your children need to go to an Orthodox school. So you automatically are living in a community where there's this baseline assumption that everybody more or less shares your values. I don't want to say that it's completely monolithic, but there's this understanding that probably a lot of people who live around you also keep Shabbat and are going to have you over for meals where people are not going to be using their phones. When someone has a baby, there's an automatic meal train thing that gets sent out and everybody signs up and it's just sort of expected. There are things like text chains that happen when someone dies so that you know where to go to visit someone who's sitting Shiva and when they need a minyan, a prayer quorum at that person's house. It's so different than the way that I grew up, where I grew up in a relatively small-ish town, but a pretty standard suburb. People knew one another, but to me, this feels drastically different, where you're really seeing the highs and lows of people's lives, their personal lives, in a way that feels very intimate. And it's interesting for me to watch my children have that experience.
Traditional Catholicism is kind of a broad label. At a basic level, it means favoring the beliefs, practices, and customs associated with the Catholic Church before the liberalization that occurred in the 1960s. How you choose to favor those things can vary a good bit, though, ranging from enjoying the Latin version of Catholic Mass and taking a more stringent approach to theology, all the way to questioning the authority of the current Pope. Julia Yost is on the former side of that continuum. She recognizes Pope Francis as the head of the Catholic Church, but she also has great reverence for the rules and practices of the Church that guided worshipers for centuries. Rules and practices whose emphasis has been watered down over the past few decades. One such practice is an emphasis on traditional prayer. To less religious people, reciting prayers and even participating in rituals can sometimes seem like a waste of time. But one thing science has shown is that a regular prayer practice isn't only a buffer against depression, but also increases life satisfaction, especially in young adults. Why exactly? Science doesn't have a clear answer yet. But putting that aside, this shines a light on one reason why people find more orthodox forms of faith attractive. When it comes to praying, always trying to find the right words can be difficult, especially if you're praying multiple times a day. Recognizing this, more traditional faiths offer a litany of prayers and ways and times to say them. And according to Julia, that's a good thing.
I'm a big fan of regular formulaic prayer, and the experience of bereavement really brings out my reasons for that. So what do I mean by formulaic prayer? Say, I have here a correct religious sentiment. I did not compose it. I'm not the author, but I agree with it. And to the extent that my intellect and affections and will are conformed to it, they are elevated, and so I recite it, and I address that recitation to God. So by contrast, some Christians would say that the best prayer, and maybe even the only acceptable prayer, is spontaneous. It's organic to what you are really thinking and feeling in that moment. Nothing wrong with that, plenty to be said for it. But I do also find formulaic prayer very useful, in part because it assures me that I don't need to be in the mood for my prayers to be heard. So I can, for instance, pray for the departed for years and years after the keen phase of grief has passed. And I establish that habit, and I can trust that it will be efficacious. And I do find that it is a property of bereavement that it leaves us thinking that there's something we need to do if we could just figure it out. So the time has passed for tending to the departed, saying goodbyes, but we feel like there's something left undone. There's something still to do.
In Judaism, they call this the distinction between the keva, the words of the prayer, and the kevanah, the feeling behind it. But as Julia points out, having the right words ready can help people express and maybe reinforce a sentiment they believe in, even if they're not in the exact right emotional state at the moment. It kind of creates a habit, and one that, from everything we can tell, can be good for your health. Still, this notion of a habit raises an interesting point. For some people, the purpose of faith isn't necessarily about communing with the divine at all times, or as Julia might say, being in the mood.
My position now is more that I have my religious obligations. I try to meet them. I don't care too much about my interior states. And whereas some people describe themselves as, spiritual but not religious, I describe myself as religious but not spiritual.
But that's not how it started. When Julia first decided to transition from the relatively lax brand of Catholicism she was raised with to the more traditional form she now follows, her approach was different.
I was in this early stage of zeal, and young people like to take up these inspiriting projects. And my brand of zealotry was pretty tame as these things go, but still I was trying to sort of be a bit more otherworldly and above things, and that can be really isolating. The traditional Christian attitude of contemptus mundi, or contempt of the world, it's supposed to make you more charitable, make you love God and your neighbor more than worldly possessions. But if you're not fully a grown-up, it just shades into contempt for the people around you who happen not to be conforming to your ideals. So you go to a family reunion and you encounter a cousin who went to Catholic school, but now she's lapsed. She's shacked up with her boyfriend, and you think, yeah, she's going to hell. And even if you do not express this prognosis to her, it's going to make you unpleasant company, and it's also not going to make you happy, because thinking ill of the people around you constantly, it's not actually fun. I don't think there's anything about this that's really particular to Catholicism or even religion, because young people do like to attach themselves to these projects, which don't have to be religious. They could be political projects, more or less revolutionary. That could be morally informed disciplines like veganism, and young converts to all these kinds of causes can exhibit the kind of righteous cruelty that I did. There are lots of ways of being horrible. And so I would say that today I have all the same moral convictions that I had then, but my attitude now is more, maybe if we say enough prayers, God will just wave everybody through, which is a perfectly orthodox hope, and it's also, I think, a more Christian sentiment.
What about your faith or practice allowed you to change that?
Oh, I think it was just getting older, coming to have a better understanding of what is actually meant by the commandment to love God. As I got older, I came to value ardor and zeal a lot less. So that's to say, these kind of high religious sentiments, which had been, when I was younger, really kind of part of the point of the conversion. You dignify and enchant your life by having this otherworldly outlook. You kind of raise the moral stakes on everything. You keep your eye on this invisible world that imbues the visible world with meaning. And you feel that you kind of need to be worked up to a pitch of enthusiasm all the time. But I found that exhausting and discouraging because I just couldn't maintain it. I don't think most people can. So there's that kind of practical issue with it. But also, I just came to take seriously that the commandment to love God addresses the will rather than the affections. And so if you're saying your prayers dutifully and you find that you're not necessarily experiencing, any mystical ecstasy, that's really fine. You're not doing it wrong just because you're not having the big feelings. You're doing your job. It's all fine. The feelings are not of the essence, nor do you need to be worked up with this kind of partisan zeal about the conduct of the people around you just in order to maintain your own convictions. It just does not follow.
Sometimes, though, the zeal with which young people adopt a stricter form of faith can come from a desire to explore something exotic, or even to push back against cultural norms. Right now, it's happening in a small but influential group of New York City millennials and Gen Zers. Julia recently wrote a piece for the New York Times on this movement, which, as she describes it, is a protest of sorts against liberalized views.
Young people love to do this, right? They love to do something that's scandalous, something that's a little bit edgy. So what does that even look like if you've been raised in this kind of liquid world in which the establishment thing is to, deny the reality of human sexual difference? So what do you do to shock those people? Well, you insist on the reality of human sexual difference. So there is this little set in downtown Manhattan they have this kind of avant-garde scene, and part of what they're doing is they're dabbling with these scandalous opinions like right-wing political opinions or traditional religion. So obviously it's partly a pose, or it's partly just, it's fashion, it's done for effect.
It's performative for some, yeah.
It is, yeah. But I don't find performativity necessarily at odds with sincerity. For the most part, I think these kids are really just like anybody else. In one way or another, they are praying, "We believe, Lord, help our unbelief." That is just a very Christian thing to do. And so, yeah, I mean, ritual is performative. You always have an audience of at least one. You have to imagine that God is watching, God is hearing your prayers. And if you're overly concerned with authenticity, well, did I really mean that prayer, etc., that's only going to make you more performative because you have to keep checking in on yourself. And that's a much more tortured and self-conscious relation to your own religious practice than I think Catholicism needs you to have. Like, just do the work and leave the rest to God, including really the credit.
Outside of the small group, there is evidence of a growing trend, although still the minority, of millennials and other younger adults who are embracing more conservative views and more conservative faiths. Do you have a sense what it is about society right now that might be nudging people that direction, at least some of them?
I think that trend partly is caused by and partly accelerates polarization in our society. Just everywhere you look, I think the liberal middle, which I think my cinder block parish was part of, it's collapsing. It's just giving way to, extreme left or woke takes on race, sex, whatever. Or, in reaction, very, very trad or orthodox takes on those same issues. I think the middle just is losing its hold on the imaginations of young people. You can see this, I think, most clearly in data on Reform Judaism. If you look at the distribution sort of down the generations, Reform used to be so strong. Among 65 and older, very, very strong. And it loses power with every generation. It's the poles that are increasing, secular Jews over here, so Jews of no religion, ethnic but no religion, and then orthodoxy. Modern orthodoxy is getting bigger and bigger. I think probably it's not quite that stark within Catholicism, but there's just kind of a similar thing, this sense that, pick your side. If your inclinations are liberal, why not just go all the way? Why not be progressive? Why be moderate, be progressive? And if you're not interested in being progressive, I think you kind of view liberalism as a halfway house. It's just not someplace you can stay. So if you want to hang on to something, if you want something solid, you want something traditional, you have to do the kind of self-consistent, really self-aware, straight up trad version of that.
On this point, the data back Julia up. Religious polarization is increasing in the U.S. People are moving toward the extremes, all in or all out. And for those moving in the traditional direction, it's often a principled stance.
If you just talk to these people, you find them saying some things that are pretty cogent critiques of the world they were raised in and expressions of disaffection with it. So there's a kind of exhaustion or disenchantment with liberal moralism. There's a desire for just more freedom, a desire to have space to think and not to have your thoughts policed and not to worry that you're going to be canceled for expressing an opinion that would have been uncontroversial 5 years ago. I also think that for a lot of young people today, as for me back when I was in college, trad Catholicism often just aligns with certain intuitions that people have about what life is and what they want out of it, such as that it is okay for a college-educated woman to want to get married and have kids, and if it means sacrificing her career and she wants to do it that way, that's okay, and she's not a failure. That is a sentiment that I have heard described by young women who are in this scene.
This is a good time to acknowledge one of the larger criticisms that can be leveled against more orthodox religious traditions. They don't only favor traditional gender roles, they also have a lot of gender inequality baked in. Making the choice to accept that as part of your life is a personal one. For some, it means being okay with trade-offs. The benefits of the faith outweigh the drawbacks. For others, it's a way of life that makes sense to them.
I think it's worth saying that a kind of traditional conception of gender roles really isn't that far afield of the way at least middle class or professional class households do tend to conduct their business these days. So a really orthodox Catholic household, what does that look like? Well, the wife might work, she might not. She probably spends more time with the kids than her husband does. She probably spends more time on housework. He probably spends more time on economic activity outside the home. This is true of trad households. It's true of, secular professional class households too. And so I'm just very much not offended by an ancient faith that maintains, this is okay. And we don't have to be shattering glass ceilings all the time. And we don't have to be breaking down norms and boundaries.
It's true that on average, millennials and Gen Zers are moving away from religion. But this pattern obscures a more complex one. Many are looking to be spiritual, but outside the bounds of traditional faiths. Others, like Kelsey and Julia, are turning toward faith traditions that have existed for centuries. Traditions whose obligations and theologies are as demanding as they are complex. The reasons why vary. Community, a sense of moral clarity, the beauty and mystery of rites and rituals, or even an edgy protest. But a turn to older traditions, almost by definition, comes with conflicts. For some, that conflict is a personal one that requires navigating trade-offs between modern social norms and older ones. Norms for more equality and freedom versus ones for less. For others, it's not a personal conflict, but a societal one. A pushback against liberalizing norms that they believe are unwise. Where anyone comes down on these issues is a personal choice. My own hope is that in the U.S., we'll be able to live up to our aspirations as a country to keep religion and policymaking separate, to be a place where people can practice or not as they wish, as long as it doesn't influence the rights of others to do what they believe. But putting politics aside, what's clear is that America's religious landscape is in a period of transition. And while older generations seem to be sticking to their usual ways, younger ones are exploring many different paths. How God Works is hosted and written by me, Dave DeSteno. Our senior producer is Josie Holtzman, our producer is Sophie Eisenberg, and executive producer is Genevieve Sponsler. Melissa Streifert is our intern. Merritt Jacob is our mix engineer and composed our theme, which was arranged by Chloe DeSteno. The executive producer of PRX Productions is Jocelyn Gonzalez. This podcast was also made possible with support from the John Templeton Foundation. If you want to learn more, you can follow me on Twitter @DavidDeSteno.